Please turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 4. Text this morning, as we continue in our series on the miracles of Jesus, we come to one of the more iconic, memorable miracles of Jesus, that is the calming of the storm. We'll be looking at the account in Mark chapter 4. And beginning in verse number 35. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now, when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was. And other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Fear. Fear is good and fear is bad. We need some balance of fear. Fear is life-saving. If we were not afraid of things, I think our lives would probably be short. Imagine how many dangers that we would fall into, not even knowing, not even sensing the danger. Fear is a gift of God. It gives us a sensitivity that we're mortal, and we know we're mortal. We know we're very vulnerable to a lot of things. And so fear has a very healthy place in our lives that guides us and keeps us from a lot of harms. And so we can be thankful that we have a sense of fear. It is a blessing of God that we have that. But fear can also be life-robbing. Fear can make us timid so that we are unwilling to branch out and take any kind of even reasonable risk. That fear can build upon fear so that we become dominated by our fears. And keeps us to be small people, living in small worlds. And because of that, we don't experience life as we should. We don't meet new people who might be a possibility of being a great friend or being an interesting contact. We might not try a business adventure that might cause us to become very profitable and a blessing to others. We might not be able to take advantage of 1,000 fun activities. We might not ever meet the girl or the guy of our dreams if we don't have enough courage to move out of our little comfort zone. If fear is too great, we don't have the ability to do any acts of courage that might preserve the freedoms of our country or the safety of our family. And so we need some kind of way to work through the goodness of fear, but not letting it become too great to cause us to be too small. One of the great things that can happen to our fear is we could have a leader who can help us, a commander. The commander of a military force, one of their jobs is to help the ones following them under their authority to overcome their fears, to not give way to their fears, and to send them off and to cause them to be more courageous. I was blessed as a child, as a young person, to have my best friend to be that kind of leader. My best friend Ken Schoenwald was a natural leader. And he was kind of one of these fearless guys that he was not afraid to do anything. And because of it, my life was blessed. We went on so many hikes. We went on so many adventures together that I probably wouldn't even have thought of. But he was kind of one of these adventuresome guys. There was nothing too challenging that we wouldn't try. Now, of course, some of them were memorable in a not so great way. One time we were climbing in the Adirondacks Mountains. We came upon this spring that just looked deliciously inviting. And so he dove in. He said, "Oh, come on, Tim, dive in." So I dove in, and that water was like 34 degrees. And the stinging of that came through, but how many things did I forget from my youth? But that I remembered because of my friend leading us. He and his family were skiers, and so he convinced my family and myself to become skiers. And so Ken was always pushing me on. So first it's just skiing at all down the beginner slopes, and of course that's kind of thrilling and a little scary, but you finally get it. And then Ken's like, "Let's go to the intermediate slope." So we'd go up the lift to the intermediate slope, and I would look down like, "Oh, this looks pretty scary." And Ken would be gone, "Come on, Tim, let's go." And so I'd learned that, and then after we mastered that, "Let's go to the expert slopes." And one of the highlights of my life, we spent a spring break together in Colorado, and we skied all the great, not all, some of the great ski resorts there, and just had the time of our life. And Ken Schoenwald was the one that helped me overcome my fears. He was kind of my personal leader. I tried to instill a little bit of that in my family. Understand, we all have in us kind of the fear and the fearlessness that kind of wage competition. In a family, you get some of that. So Lisa's kind of on the more fearful side. I'm a little bit more on the fearless, not like we're opposites, but she kind of helps guide us into reasonableness, and I kind of push the family a little more. So there was this kind of famous moment in our family's history where we went to a fireworks, one of those shops, and we're looking through the fireworks one. We find this firework that says, "Light, fuse, and run." And I grab it, and I'm like, "It says light, fuse, and run. This must be good." And Lisa says, "It says light, fuse, and run." Why are you buying this thing? So anyway, you kind of get this give and take. When we were on our Western trip, we went out to the West and went up in the high mountains. And one of the great things is these sights are amazing. You're way up high, but frequently there's no guardrails. And so I'm like driving along, and I'm saying, "Look, kids, look at this." And I'm like, "Look, honey," and Lisa's there going, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not," singing hymns to herself as she's trying to endure this. "Look, honey, it's a great view." Well, we probably need some kind of balance between being fearful and not too fearful. My son must have caught some of my ambition for that. Just a couple months after he and Erica were married, they went on vacation. I forget where it was, and we were getting pictures of their vacation. One day we wake up and we see this picture of a sky with an airplane and Erica there with nothing falling from an airplane. And we're like, "You went skydiving?" "Yeah, it was great, Dad. We went skydiving." And I'm like, "Whoa, poor Erica's family. What did we get them into?" But they were fine. They said once was enough, though. Fear can cause you to be trapped in spiritual death. Satan traps people in fear. Jesus comes to be a leader that calls you out of fearing Satan and fearing his threats, that being different, of believing something hard that might cause you to be a different kind of person. Satan wants you to fear. He wants to keep you small. And even if you happen to become a Christian, he wants you to be a useless Christian. A Christian that is so timid that they're afraid to talk to anybody, afraid to venture to any place. Jesus, when he was training his disciples, he gets a group of disciples that, granted, they're probably just normal people. In fact, they might have been above average. They're fishermen, a lot of them. And they probably didn't have a lot of those fears, but they still feared. And in the time of Jesus' life, they have a lot of times where they are driven by fear. But somehow by the end of the story, by the time they get to the book of Acts, the disciples are fearless. In the book of Acts, they're bold, and you're like, "I want to be like that." Well, I hope this text this morning about Jesus teaching his disciples to both not fear, but fear the right thing, hopefully it can help you become more courageous. It might compel you to not give way to Satan's threats, but you might have a courage. Jesus wants to lead you into courageous, not fearing the world or the devil, but having a fear of him. 6 things I'd like to point out about this text, about Jesus who has mastery of the sea. maybe before I do that, I might point out I see parallels between this story and the Jonah story. There's a number of things that these stories have in common. You get this person who is a stowaway, who's not the sailor, who falls asleep in the boat, and there's a tremendous storm that scares all the sailors to death. And they wake up the person that's sleeping and saying, "Don't you care? Don't you call upon your God?" And so there's a great deal of overlap between them. But there's also a couple of significant differences that make me want to call this the anti-Jonah story. Jonah is told to go to Nineveh. He doesn't want, so there's a great storm to turn him around to cause him to go. In this story, Jesus wants to go to the other side, and I might add that I think this story and the next story go together. This week and next week are really meant to be seen together. What's the next story? On the other side of the sea, there's a man with a legion of demons who scares everybody to death. And he lives in the tombs, and nobody can bind him. And Jesus wants to go to deliver him, but there's something that's going to keep him from going, this storm. And so in this storm, Jesus has to press through the storm to get there. But I do think it's like the anti-Jonah. Jesus is being obedient where Jonah was being disobedient, but they do share many things in common. I think we can use the one story to help us understand the other. So Jesus says, we're going to go to the other side. They've been busy. There's plenty of ministry to do here. The other side of the Sea of Galilee is the side of the Gentiles. It's the Decapolis, the city of the 10 cities. And these cities are dominated by people who are different from the Jews. And Jesus has a mind to reach them. Kind of like Nineveh is the Gentiles, the pagans. The other side is where the pagans are, and Jesus is going to go. And it's forbidding. And Jesus is leading his disciples on this journey to go to a place that they probably wouldn't naturally go. And to get there, they're going to have to overcome some fears, maybe some adversity, some lack of desire to go. And Jesus is going to lead them there because he's going to proclaim his gracious rule. God wants to move you out of just a small, fairly comfortable life that's kind of boring into a life that's more exciting, but a little more dangerous. In order to get there, you're going to have to conquer some of your fears. You're going to have to say, I'm going to trust Jesus. Now, when we think about fear is kind of like, okay, here are the dangers. Okay, it's good to consider the dangers. God doesn't want us to be careless. But you should not only consider the dangers, you should consider the opportunities. If you try to do this thing, okay, you might face some dangers, but you might be able to also expand something. So by taking some risk, you might have some benefit. And not only should you consider the possibility of what the opportunities are, and maybe the cost of not following up on those opportunities, you might also consider what resources you have, what skills you have. Now, when you first try to do something, you might think, well, I can't do this, but then you find God gives you resources. And he enables you to be able to do things, I don't know if I ever could have done that before. So those of us that speak a lot in public, there were times in our lives, in fact, even now, times in my life that I think, I don't want to speak in public. You say something stupid, people laugh at you. And it's true, they do. But you find that when you try it, it's not as bad as you thought. And you have resources and you have provisions that God does things that you weren't counting on him doing. And so you not only need to count all the costs, you also need to count what are the provisions, what are the opportunities. And if God's going to reach the world for Christ through people like us, we're going to have a sense he's leading us. Sometimes to forbidding places. Sometimes to difficult places. And so Jesus is teaching his disciples to overcome their fears. They're going to encounter the worst of their fears. But they have resources that they hadn't thought about. They have some provisions that surprise them. That they're like, maybe we can do this thing. Maybe we are stronger in God than we thought that we were. Second, this master of the sea leads his crew through soul-threatening, fearful storms. Look at the text again in Mark chapter 4. Verse 35, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats also were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. Just a quick note about the text. Scholars have pored over the Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Mark in this case. And scholars have come to see that Mark tends to come from a perspective. Like when you read it, you can hear someone saying, "I saw this and I saw that." And we're pretty sure it's Peter. Only Peter has told the story to Mark, and Mark turns the I into he, or the we into they. And it has these kind of observations, and you can kind of see little details that come in the story that make you think you're getting an eyewitness perspective from someone who is on this boat, and we think it as Peter. And so it's kind of an evidence of the authenticity of the story, of little details that help you think this is somebody telling this story that was there. But just back to the story now, is we're at the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is unique in the world in that it's the lowest place on earth. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. And if you kind of are into meteorology, one of the things you know about that additional 700 feet of atmosphere make the temperatures go higher. And so the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee tend to be very hot a lot of the year. You get very high temperatures there. So when you go up from the Sea of Galilee, it's like in a bowl, like in a basin. And up on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee are the Golan Heights. And to the northeast is Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is 9,200 feet high. And it snows there. It's way up in the atmosphere before the sun's able to heat up. But so you get cold weather up on Mount Hermon, and you get very hot weather down here. And those elementary students that have been studying weather, what happens when you get hot and cold close to each other? You get wind. So every now and then, this cold weather comes and mixes with the hot weather, and you get violent storms. And that's what this is. You get a raging storm that the people in that area still today call it Shakira, or Shakira, meaning it comes from the word shark, the Arabic word for shark. It's the shark. It's the wind with teeth. These are violent storms, and they can come very quickly, and they can threaten those that are on the sea. And so the disciples are in a fairly small boat. Another little historical incident, just because you should know this if you don't know this, is in 1986, there was a drought in Israel. And the levels of the Sea of Galilee went down as low as they ever had been remembered. And because of that, it exposed the shore further. And in the mud that was exposed from that, they found a wooden boat that was about 28 feet long, about 7 feet wide, about 4 feet high, with decking on the front and the back for people to sit. But would fit about 15 people. And they did carbon-14 dating on it, and it came to about the year AD 30. So, there's no way it's actually this boat, right? But it's a boat exactly like this, and so we know now what they look like. We'd seen some before by mosaics they had painted, but this was the first boat they actually found that lasted 2,000 years and called the Jesus boat, I think, or the Galilee boat, something like that. Anyway, you can go and visit it if you go to the Sea of Galilee today. But a storm. Now, like I said earlier in our service, we kind of are land creatures now. Airplanes have kind of killed the romance of seafaring. So you get the shipping, of course, that are using the oceans, but people, just travelers, don't use it anymore. But I was on a whale watching cruise once out the coast of Massachusetts. And a little storm came up. And that boat's kind of going up and down and up and down, back and forth. And you realize that you kind of like land. That solidness of knowing where you're staying, and that kind of being all over the place and tossing and turning, and I don't need to tell you what half the people in the boat were doing, but anyway, it was kind of a trial, and you're like, I can't wait to get back to shore. Can you imagine? That was just a very mild, and we're in a big boat that really probably wasn't seriously threatened, but I'm like, it would be terrifying to be in a boat with a raging sea. And the disciples, even though many of them were probably accustomed to the sea, no one could be accustomed to this. The sea is raging. and it's threatening their lives. And they realize that they are going to perish. The boat's beginning to fill up with water, and they are about to sink. So much so that they're panicking over this, and something beyond their dreams. They know that their lives are over. Our lives are full of storms. Not full of storms, but you're going to have storms in your life. And they'll probably come suddenly, they'll catch you by surprise, and they'll shake you. And they'll toss you. And they'll cause your soul to fear. And you'll begin to wonder what it was like when you were secure. And you had confidence that you knew it was going to happen next week or even next year. Of course, nobody knows for sure, but we think we know. And then in some times of life, all that security is taken away, and you're just naked before the reality of your mortality, your smallness, your powerlessness. Disciples can't do anything to fix the storm. They have no power, and you will have times in your life where you realize you have no power. And then add to that the fact that some people are threatened by other people. We believe that Mark was writing his gospel to help encourage Christians who had been suffering under Nero's rage. There was a great fire in Rome that we don't really know who started it, but the people blamed Nero for starting the fire because it burned down housing districts that he had proposed to replace new housing. He wanted to do this great project. The Senate didn't want him to do it. And by some coincidence, the place burned down, so they had to rebuild. And people said Nero did it. And we don't actually think Nero did it, but Nero had a problem. And his solution to the problem was that there was a small group of people who were different in Rome. And they were followers of this person they called Christ. And he didn't really know who Christ was. He didn't really care. But he knew that these people were suspected of being different and being obstacles. And so Nero blamed the Christians for this fire. And there was a great outflowing of persecution against the Christians. And so people were like fleeing, and they're like, whoa, I just wanted to be saved. I just wanted to have everlasting life. And now Nero is throwing us to the wolves, putting us up on crosses. We're in a storm. Mark writes his gospel to call Christians to be courageous against these soul-threatening storms, to be strong. There's a storm raging. You can't even do anything about it. You can't stop it. But you can be courageous. So when we get to these storms, we might fear, what do I do? What did I get into? Where do I go? Self-reliance is not going to do it. Now, you ought to be self-reliant in 100 ways. Don't be a burden to other people. Get a job, pay your bills, have a little extra to share with family and friends, all that. But there'll be times in your life that you realize, I can't be self-sufficient for this. The storm is too great. It's too big. God sends these storms to teach us. There's some lessons that we can't learn except through great trials. It would be nice that students grew when everything was just sweet and peaceful and perfect. But there's some things we can't learn until we're really tested, until we're really tried, until the ground is taken out from under us and all we can depend upon is God. The disciples are being tested. So what do? Well, they start rowing, they start bailing, but they can't do it. And so they go to Jesus. And there Jesus is, like Jonah, asleep. He's asleep in the boat. Verse 38, but he was in the stern. By the way, a little suggestion that maybe he was an eyewitness, because this is actually a technical word for the back of the boat, which tells you somebody knew what the back of the boat was called. Apparently you call it the stern. And so a little evidence that whoever wrote this had a little more technical knowledge than somebody that didn't know about boats. Granted, that's not a lot of knowledge, but it's at least a little bit of knowledge. He was in the back of the boat, the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? they are scandalized that Jesus is able to sleep through this storm. Maybe sleeping at all. Sleeping in a boat doesn't sound like the easiest thing, but he's probably tired. But when this storm started, you'd think Jesus would wake up. And you'd think he'd have this some kind of natural fear going on. This kind of natural instinct that something is wrong. And Jesus doesn't seem to have that instinct. And the disciples are like, what is this, a suicide mission? What are you doing? Are you just going to let this, aren't you going to row? Aren't you going to be concerned? How could you sleep? What I think is going on here is like the other miracles we've studied, I believe this is a bit of a parable, a living parable. That is, it really happened. Jesus was really sleeping in a boat in a storm on the way across the sea to meet this demoniac guy with 1,000 or 6,000 demons, however many it has. That really happened. But I believe Mark is giving us a picture of Jesus resting the sleep of death. That Jesus is going to die for the sins of the world. He's going to take upon the wrath. He's going to take upon Satan's wrath, and he's going to take upon the wrath of his Father. And Jesus is going to die. And his disciples are going to be like, what happened? This was not the plan. One of the reasons I think that it's a picture of death is that they're going to the tombs. When they get to the other side of the sea, they're going to be at the tombs. They're going to be in the place of death. Also, I think it's a place it's going to be death because that's the theme of Mark's gospel. Mark is calling people to take up their cross and follow Jesus. Take up your death and follow him. And he's urging people to count the cost, is to be willing rather to die than to lose Christ. And they should rest with Jesus. And I believe the story here is telling us that Jesus is seeing that death is like sleep for the Christian, the person that's with Christ. The greatest problem of all would be death, right? For the Christian, it's sleep. For the Christian, it's not terrifying. The devil can throw the worst of his schemes at us. He can rage. He can threaten. He can say, I'm going to take your life. And we can say, but Jesus is with me. And with Jesus, death is like sleep. That you wake up and you speak a word and it's life and peace again. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 tells us that the devil had the power to make people of fear because he had the power of death. Keeping people under his tyranny. Either by saying, this life was all I have to live for and I die, so what? Which is kind of a shallow way of thinking about eternity. It's denying eternity. Or people afraid of death and being called into obeying the evil one's plan, like Nero's plan himself. Jesus' sleep is not the sleep of resignation, of suicide. He's not Jonah here. Jonah says, cast me in the sea because I don't care about life. I'd rather die than serve God. Jesus is saying, I'd rather die than not serve God. That Jesus is the one who is devoted to the Master's plan, his Father's plan. Death is not an ultimate destructive power for the Christian. Again, Hebrews 2:14, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. The raging waves of the sea in the ancient world would have been seen as chaos, as the worst of the gods, of the most uncontrollable of the gods. In a way, Jesus is going he's taking upon those demons of destruction and chaos. He's going through them. And he's going through them willingly with devotion, and it's like sleep. It's like sleep that has a period, and it gives rise to waking and rising and having life and control again. Jesus conquers these powers. Colossians chapter 2 tells us that because of the cross of Christ, he has disarmed the principalities and the powers. That is a reference to demons and Satan's raging power. Jesus has disarmed the principalities and powers, and he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it that is in the cross. Ephesians 1 tells us that when Jesus was raised from the dead, he was raised and seated at the right hand of the Father, far above all principality and power and might and dominion. That over the raging seas, Jesus' death leads him to a power of great might. Jesus challenges his disciples, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? Disciples had not thought in terms of this big of faith, this big of a power. Jesus is teaching them, I have the power that can handle the rage that brings death, and we need not fear it. So Jesus wakes up from his sleep, stands in the boat, and says, verse 39, he arose and rebuked the wind. The word rebuked tends to be used in Mark and all the Gospels for what you do to demons. Jesus is telling the world of chaos and rebellion. He's rebuking it, said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Winds don't just cease, they slowly calm down. And even when winds calm down, the sea rages for hours. But Jesus, in great power and authority, speaks a word, and the wind hears and says, my master says, be still, and so I'm going to be still. And the raging sea that usually takes hours to get calm, all of a sudden, the master says, be still and be calm. And we get the idea that the scene totally changes. The difference between a raging sea and a calm sea is one of the most dramatic changes you can ever experience. A water, when it's still, and it's still like that, it looks so friendly. It's so inviting. It's like it's home. You just want to rest and relax. A minute before it was raging, and now it's calm, and it's friendly, and it's saying, you're welcome here. Please cross at your leisure. All at the power of the word of Jesus. What Mark is telling us is that the disciples encountered the power that was in Jesus that was remarkably self-contained. Jesus does not make a sacrifice and call upon the gods. He doesn't even bow in prayer and pray to God himself. He acts with the power of God himself. The Psalms say that it's only God that can do this. That God can speak a word and nature hears its commander and it obeys. In other words, Jesus is demonstrating his identity as God himself. God in human form. Not just a great prophet who would have prayed to God to do it, but God speaking as God, saying, peace be still, to his servant, the wind and the seas. Jesus has demonstrated absolute authority over all powers. Therefore, there's no power that we should fear outside of him. He is the supreme power. The wind and the sea, who can control those? Jesus can. Nero's legion of armies performing atrocities at their will is nothing compared to the power of Jesus. He has all these forces under his dominion. And you might say, well, why does he wait so long? Well, think about it from his point of view. What difference does it make how long he waits? When it happens, all is good. In the meantime, we get to learn some lessons of faith, some lessons of trust. Sure, it'd be nice if life was easy, but what kind of character would we be? What kind of praise would our praise be worth if we've never learned how to not fear one thing because something is so much greater? That's the glory of the praise of Jesus for those who knows his power over the storm. Jesus is calling us to follow him because he has absolute authority and power. In Mark chapter 8, verse 34, we read, when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. He goes on to say, whoever is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of him in the day of my glory. But who is not ashamed of me, I will honor with life and blessing. The one who knows his power. Number 5, Jesus is calling out this faith. Verse 40, he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" I read these not as severe rebukes. I don't know that it's very surprising to me that they didn't have faith. But they are clearly lessons, and hard lessons. No matter what problems or fears or chaos you face, Jesus calls you to believe that he is greater than them, that he has power over them. And he's urging you to rest in his assurance. It's not that he didn't care. Earlier they said, "Don't you care?" I think what they meant was, "Aren't you upset by this?" Jesus is not only not upset, he does care for them. He cares for you. Some of the great stories in church history and Christian history are people who fear Jesus and trust him more than the raging of the world. The world's all upset. It's all in turmoil. It thinks we're all going to be afraid. It wants us all to be afraid. One of the things we ought to think about just politically, from a political point of view, is we want a government that encourages us not to fear, and not a government that wants us to fear. We need courageous people. To be difference makers, you got to be courageous. To be someone that impacts others for good, you have to be courageous. Someone that has confidence, someone that has courage, someone that has assurance it's going to be well. That's why we love these Christian missionary biographies where these guys and these ladies are like, courageous, let me at them, let me go, release me. Let me talk to these people about the Lord, because they have a faith and assurance that all is well. Just here in our quiet, private lives, we need courage to live for God, to lead our families through the chaos, through the times, with courage saying, it's good, we are sound not because our government's going to necessarily take care of us, we hope they do, but even if they don't, Jesus has the power that we can have faith and assurance to rest in his care. Like the end of the story of Jonah, when the seas were calmed, the sailors feared God greatly and offered vows and promises to him. This story ends the same way. Verse 41, and they feared exceedingly. They feared exceedingly. When we first read that, we might think this is a little bit odd. Okay, the storm was raging. We understand that fear. They were about to drown in a terrible way. That's fearful. But when Jesus calms it, Mark uses a stronger word for fear. They were terrified of the storm, and they were exceedingly terrified of Jesus. Why? Well, their friend had just rebuked nature, and nature heard him. And they realized that they didn't know who Jesus was yet. That he had done something that people aren't supposed to be able to do. When your best friend, as much as you looked up to him, doesn't just do great things, but he leaps tall buildings, and he calms the storms, you realize, I better rethink who this person is. And I can't control him. We kind of get used to people being able to do little things. We kind of know some people a little stronger. We calculate that. But this person is power beyond our means. We better be careful how we think about him. And so they feared Jesus, and they began to respect his power. Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? You need a great reverence for God. You need to have a sense of how powerful God is in Jesus. That our commander deserves our awe. He deserves for us to have a great respect for him, of what he can do, of his great power. And that awe should then be connected to an allegiance, because his power is devoted to our rescue. It's devoted to our redemption. It's devoted to our reclamation and our exaltation. And so he deserves our allegiance. He's the commander of a great power, of great forces, and he's calling a team of allegiance. I fear him, but I also trust him. And I'll do anything with him because I now see what his power can do. And that power should lead us to courage. Jesus deserves your awe, your allegiance, your courage. don't live by spiritual fear. Don't live by fear. I mean, fear has a place. It causes you to be wiser. But don't let fear not have a champion that also calls you to ambitious things, that cause you to break out and to meet new people, to try new ministries, to cross the street or even the state or even the ocean, to go and find people to share the gracious rule of Christ. Don't need to fear Nero or the storm or even Stalin or Hitler or Biden. Don't fear. Trust this great supreme one, this commander, the master of the seas. Let's pray. Father, I do pray that we would not be a people driven by fears so that Satan might manipulate us and cause us to cower or hide and live small kind of lives. Lord, we want the exuberant, ambitious kind of life that lives openly for you, knowing that you can just command the seas and they obey you, the wind and it calms. You control all these things. You have us in your hands. We're not alone. And even if we should face death, you have mocked death by conquering it, and you'll conquer it for us as well. You have. Lord, I pray for anyone who has never trusted in Christ. They've never seen their need for forgiveness of sins, for someone to die for them. I pray, Lord, that you would call them to believe, to trust, to put their hope in Christ, and that Christ would be their life and their commander, and that they would follow him wherever he leads. Be glorified, Lord, in our response to your word. In Jesus' name, amen.